Yet we remain the only continent without a permanent seat at the main table, where decisions about our destiny are made. Africa deserves, ladies and gentlemen, at the very least, 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the right to veto, and 2 additional non-permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. The world must understand that reforming the Security Council is not a favor to Africa or to anybody. It is a necessity for the United Nations' own survival.
Imagine this: a war resolution being drafted at the United Nations, the usual 5, America, Britain, France, Russia, and China, lining up to decide the fate of a smaller nation. And then, suddenly, Africa raises its hand. A single word: veto. The hall freezes. The Western diplomats shift uncomfortably. The cameras zoom in. The balance of global power, for the first time in 80 years, tilts ever so slightly toward the continent that has long been treated as the subject, never the speaker. That is not fiction. That is the world Kenya's President William Ruto dared to imagine and demand at the 79th United Nations General Assembly in New York. Standing before an audience of world leaders, Ruto broke a diplomatic taboo. He didn't just ask for representation. He issued an ultimatum. Either the UN reforms to include Africa as an equal, with 2 permanent seats and full veto powers, or it risks becoming, in his words, irrelevant in the 21st century. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind that follows when someone says what everyone else was too scared to say. Because behind the glass smiles and applause, every major power in that hall knew what Ruto had just done. He had called out the last colonial structure still running in broad daylight, the UN Security Council itself. And the question now echoing across the corridors of diplomacy is, what really happened that made Ruto so bold? Why this tone, this timing, this defiance? In this video, let's find out. When President William Ruto took the UN podium, he didn't read a polished globalist script or trade polite diplomatic compliments. His words had the precision of a courtroom argument and the fire of a political revolt. Ruto's message was clear: Africa is done asking politely. For 2 decades, reform of the UN Security Council has been discussed, debated, deferred, but never delivered. The world keeps changing, yet the same 5 countries still monopolize global veto power, the same victors of World War II deciding which wars are justified and which nations are rogue. It was the most forceful African address to the UNGA since Kwame Nkrumah's 1960 speech on decolonization. Except this time, the battlefield isn't colonial borders. It's global governance itself. For years, African leaders have demanded fair representation on the Security Council. But Ruto's call didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a growing fury across the continent. Africa currently makes up 28% of all UN member states and contributes over 40% of global peacekeeping forces. Yet it has 0 permanent seats and no veto power, the ultimate tool of global influence. Every year, over half the Security Council's agenda involves African crises: Mali, Sudan, Somalia, Congo, Central African Republic. Decisions about African conflicts, sanctions, and interventions are routinely made without African participation. It's a system that looks like multilateralism, but feels like colonialism with better lighting. Ruto's logic was simple. How can a continent that carries the weight of global peacekeeping, that holds the largest share of natural resources, and that bears the cost of instability, have no say in how global security is defined? In essence, he was telling the world, the UN is not legitimate anymore, and unless it evolves, it will collapse under its own hypocrisy. But to understand why Ruto's demand sounded like a thunderclap, we have to remember what the Security Council really is. Created in 1945, the UNSC was designed by the 5 victors of World War II, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, then the USSR, and China. They gave themselves permanent seats and veto power, meaning that any one of them can single-handedly block any global decision, from military intervention to humanitarian sanctions. That power has never been redistributed. Not once. Not even as dozens of new nations, many of them African, joined the UN in the post-colonial era. What does that mean in practice? It means that the US can veto resolutions that benefit other countries. Britain and France, colonial relics, can veto African resolutions that threaten their economic interests. So when RUTO said Africa must have veto power too, he wasn't just asking for a seat at the table. He was threatening to flip the table itself. Because an African veto would mean something the world has never seen: the colonized finally having the power to block the colonizer. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. Now let's break down RUTO's demand. He called for 2 permanent seats with full veto rights, plus 2 additional non-permanent seats for Africa. But why 2? Because Africa isn't one country. It's 54 nations, representing 1.4 billion people, a population larger than Europe and North America combined. It's also home to some of the fastest-growing economies, like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia among them. Moreover, Africa contributes heavily to the UN's own missions. Kenya leads the international peacekeeping mission in Haiti. Rwanda, Ghana, and Senegal supply thousands of troops to the UN's Blue Helmet operations. Therefore, RUTO declared that Africa's absence isn't just unfair, it's strategically suicidal for the UN. RUTO's argument is mathematical. Africa is the most discussed continent in the UNSC chambers, yet the least represented. If the Council is truly about global peace, how can the most affected region have no permanent representation? To put it bluntly, the UN needs Africa more than Africa needs the UN. Inside the UN chamber, RUTO's words landed like a storm. Some diplomats applauded politely. Others avoided eye contact. The Western delegations, used to African leaders pleading for aid, were now hearing something different, a challenge to their authority. A senior European diplomat reportedly whispered, "He's gone too far." But to many in the global South, he hadn't gone far enough. On African social media, clips of RUTO's speech went viral. For once, the narrative wasn't about Africa asking, it was about Africa warning. Back home, even RUTO's domestic critics, those angry over economic hardship and police repression, agreed that he had spoken a truth that transcends politics. In a moment, RUTO became not just Kenya's president, but the voice of a silenced continent. And interestingly, RUTO's speech wasn't random. It came at a moment of geopolitical volatility. The US is losing moral credibility after wars and double standards. Europe is distracted by Ukraine and the energy crisis. China and Russia are positioning themselves as friends of Africa, calling for multipolar reform. Africa, meanwhile, is rising in strategic importance, home to rare earths, lithium, cobalt, and the largest untapped labor market on Earth. RUTO saw the opening. His demand wasn't just moral, it was strategic. If the UN doesn't change, Africa can build alternatives, like BRICS Plus, the African Union, the Pan-African Payment System, or even a new global South security bloc. By tying Africa's dignity to the UN's survival, RUTO flipped the narrative. He wasn't begging for reform. He was threatening irrelevance for those who ignore it. Now, if the West dismisses RUTO's demand, the consequences will be irreversible. The UN will lose the global South's moral trust, and the world will fracture into parallel systems, one Western-led, one BRICS-led, and one African-born. Already, African nations are questioning the legitimacy of institutions born in 1945. The IMF and World Bank face similar credibility crises. The African Union is preparing its own currency and payment systems. And now, If the UN resists reform, Africa may simply walk away from the idea of global governance altogether. That would be catastrophic for the West. Because if Africa, home to 30% of the world's resources and 18% of its population, stops participating in the Western system, the entire post-war order collapses. That's what RUTO meant when he said, "This is not a favor. It's a necessity for the UN's survival." RUTO's speech wasn't just a Kenyan statement. It was a continental awakening. Africa is tired of being the site of every UN mission, the subject of every humanitarian appeal, yet the absence in every real decision. From Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré to South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa, from Senegal to Ethiopia, the message is converging. Africa will no longer be managed. It will decide. A new political consciousness is rising, a Pan-Africanism of power, not poetry. The demand for veto power isn't symbolic, it's structural justice. It's the end of the advisory role and the start of equal participation. So, what really happened at the UN that day? A man from Kenya stood before the world and said the unsayable. He called out the last empire hiding behind diplomacy. He challenged the West to choose reform or irrelevance. And for a moment, in that hall of flags and marble, the world saw a glimpse of what frightens it most. An Africa that no longer asks to join the table, but demands to build a new one. What would the world look like if Africa could veto wars, sanctions, and interventions against its own people? Is the Security Council really about security, or just a gentleman's club for the victors of World War II? In the comment section below, share your thoughts on whether the structure of the UN will ever change, or if it was designed precisely to function the way it's functioning. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.